Get back to your desk, analyst. Negotiations are for trained professionals, not paper pushers. The shout echoed through the crisis command center as red emergency lights bathed everything in an ominous glow. Outside the reinforced windows of the federal building in Millbrook City, armed militants had barricaded themselves inside the courthouse across the street, holding Deputy Director Harrison Kelloway hostage along with 12 civilians. The standoff had already lasted 8 hours, and every attempt at communication had failed catastrophically. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Some of the senior negotiators laughed mockingly when the quiet brunette from the intelligence division suggested a different approach. Who does she think she is? Some kind of hostage whisperer? They whispered. But when the militants executed their first ultimatum deadline, when the SWAT commander declared the situation unwinnable, when the heavy silence of impending tragedy pressed down on everyone like a suffocating weight, the unassuming woman in the navy blazer stepped forward with steady hands and spoke just 4 words that would change everything. "Let me go alone." Half a second of absolute stunned silence. Then the gruff voice of Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the Federal Crisis Coordinator, cut through the tension. "Like hell you will, Reeves, but what nobody in that command center knew, what they couldn't possibly have imagined, was that the soft-spoken intelligence analyst adjusting her wire-rimmed glasses had once walked into far deadlier situations armed with nothing but her voice and an uncanny ability to see into the hearts of desperate people. The siege at Millbrook City Federal Courthouse had begun at 9:47 a.m. on a gray Tuesday morning in October. The building, a towering granite structure that housed both federal courts and administrative offices, sat in the heart of downtown Millbrook's government district. Dr. Lydia Reeves, 34 years old, had been analyzing terrorism, financing reports in her cramped office on the 7th floor when the first gunshots rang out. To anyone who glanced her way during normal office hours, Lydia appeared to be exactly what her employee badge claimed: Senior Intelligence Analyst, Counterterrorism Financial Division. She wore modest business attire, today a navy blue blazer over a white blouse, charcoal slacks, and sensible black flats. Her shoulder-length auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her only accessories were small silver earrings and the wire-rimmed glasses that made her look more like a university librarian than someone who spent her days tracking money flows to international terrorist organizations. She carried herself with the quiet competence of someone who preferred to blend into the background, to observe rather than be observed. Her desk was meticulously organized, financial reports arranged in precise stacks, 2 computer monitors displaying complex data spreadsheets, and a small succulent plant that somehow thrived despite the office's fluorescent lighting. To her colleagues in the intelligence division, she was simply the woman who could trace suspicious wire transfers faster than anyone else in the building, who worked late without complaining, and who never seemed to have much of a social life outside the office. What they didn't see was how her eyes tracked the security guards' patrol patterns during her lunch breaks, or how she had memorized every emergency exit and stairwell in the building within her first week of employment. They didn't notice that she always positioned herself near doorways during meetings, or that her seemingly casual questions about building security protocols revealed an unusually detailed understanding of threat assessment. Most importantly, they had no idea that her personnel file contained several pages that remained classified far above their security clearance level. The morning of the siege had started like any other. Lydia arrived at 7:30 a.m., 40 minutes before her official start time, carrying a travel mug of black coffee and a leather messenger bag that looked appropriately bureaucratic. She had been reviewing suspicious transactions from a shell company in the Balkans, when the emergency alert system activated throughout the building. Attention all personnel, security breach in progress. Initiate lockdown protocols immediately. Do not approach windows or attempt to leave the building. Through her 7th floor window, Lydia had a clear view of the courthouse steps where everything was unfolding. A black SUV had crashed through the security barriers, disgorging 6 armed figures in tactical gear. But these weren't random terrorists or desperate criminals. The way they moved, the precision of their positioning, the coordinated manner in which they secured the building's entrances, this was a professionally planned operation. Her colleagues had immediately begun the standard evacuation procedures, gathering important files and heading toward the designated safe areas in the building's interior. But Lydia remained at her window, watching and analyzing. She counted the militants, 6 visible, but their formation suggested at least 2 more inside providing overwatch. She noted their equipment, military-grade weapons, professional communication gear, and most telling of all, they weren't wearing masks. That meant they either had an exit strategy that made identification irrelevant, or they were prepared to die in place. Most concerning was their target selection. Deputy Director Kelloway wasn't just any federal official. He oversaw the department's most sensitive, counterintelligence operations. The timing wasn't random either. Today was supposed to be the final briefing for Operation Clearwater, a multi-agency investigation into foreign infiltration of domestic terrorist cells. Kelloway had been carrying classified documents when he'd entered the courthouse for what should have been a routine hearing. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As federal agencies swarmed the area, FBI crisis negotiators, ATF tactical units, local SWAT teams, Lydia found herself automatically cataloging their responses. The perimeter was established too close to the building, limiting sniper angles. The negotiation equipment was positioned where the militants could see it being set up, telegraphing every move. Most critically, the lead negotiator, Agent Raymond Torres, was approaching this like a standard hostage situation when everything about the militants' behavior suggested military training and ideological commitment. She watched Torres make his first contact attempt through a bullhorn. "This is the FBI. We want to talk. Let's work this out peacefully." The response came in the form of a single gunshot fired into the air, not a warning, but a statement. These weren't people interested in negotiation. They had an agenda, and every minute that passed was bringing them closer to completing it. "Reeves, get away from that window and report to the secure briefing room," barked Agent Sandra Walsh, the senior intelligence coordinator who had become the de facto commander of the building's response. "We need analysts running backgrounds on potential suspects." Not gawking at the situation, but as Lydia reluctantly left her observation post, she carried with her a growing certainty that everyone was approaching this crisis from the wrong angle. The militants weren't trying to escape. They weren't making demands for money or prisoner releases. They were executing a carefully planned operation with Deputy Director Kelloway as the specific target. And unless someone could get inside their decision-making process, really understand what drove them to take this desperate action, the day was going to end with a lot of people dead in the secure briefing room. Surrounded by federal agents and tactical commanders, all focused on force-based solutions, Lydia sat quietly in the back corner, analyzing financial data on her laptop while listening to the increasingly frustrated radio chatter from the scene outside. But her mind wasn't on money trails and suspicious transactions. It was calculating angles of approach, assessing the psychological profiles of militants willing to take such an extreme risk, and remembering lessons learned in places that didn't officially exist on any government map. Soon, she knew, someone would need to walk into that courthouse and face whatever was driving these people to such desperation. And despite every instinct telling her to stay hidden in the world of data and analysis she'd built for herself, Lydia was beginning to realize that someone might have to be her. The first crack in the federal response appeared exactly 93 minutes into the standoff, though most of the command staff missed it entirely. Lydia noticed it immediately. She was hunched over her laptop in the secure briefing room, ostensibly running financial background checks on potential suspects, when Agent Torres' voice crackled through the radio with barely contained frustration. "Command, this is negotiation team leader. Third attempt at phone contact has failed. They're not responding to any standard protocols." Around the table, senior agents exchanged concerned glances, but maintained their confident facade. Deputy Assistant Director Janet Morrison, a stern woman in her 50s who had flown in from Washington to oversee the crisis, tapped her pen impatiently against a stack of briefing folders. "Keep trying, Torres. They'll crack eventually. They always do." But Lydia was studying the transcript of the militants' only communication, a brief statement broadcast over emergency radio frequencies 47 minutes earlier. While everyone else had focused on analyzing the threats and demands, she was examining something far more subtle: the linguistic patterns, the cultural references embedded in their phrasing, and most importantly, what they hadn't said. "We hold Deputy Director Harrison Kelloway and 12 innocent civilians. The crimes of your government against our homeland demand justice. You have until sunset to acknowledge your failures, or blood will flow like the rivers of Krina." The reference to Krina had sent intelligence analysts scurrying to research recent Balkan conflicts, but they were looking in the wrong direction. Lydia knew that river system from personal experience, not from briefing reports or satellite imagery, but from having walked along its banks 3 years earlier during an operation that officially never happened. She pulled up her secure terminal and began cross-referencing financial transactions from her earlier investigation with a different set of parameters. The shell company in the Balkans that had caught her attention that morning, Adriatic Holdings LLC, suddenly looked far more significant. But it wasn't the money flows that made her breath catch. It was the timing. Every major transaction had occurred in the 3 weeks following the death of Dmitry Petrovic, a former Serbian military officer who had been killed in what international media reported as a tragic accident during a joint NATO training exercise. The same Dmitry Petrovic whose family Lydia had spent 2 weeks protecting during her previous life, when her job title had been very different and her work location had been classified above the pay grade of everyone currently in this room. "Agent Reeves," called Morrison sharply, noticing Lydia's intense concentration on something other than the assigned task. "I need those background reports, not whatever rabbit hole you're chasing. We have protocols to follow here." Lydia looked up from her screen, pushing her glasses up nervously. "Ma'am, I think there might be a personal motivation element we're missing." "The financial data suggests personal motivation?" interrupted Agent Walsh with a dismissive wave. "This is clearly a coordinated terrorist operation. We don't need amateur psychology from the accounting department." Several other agents chuckled, and Lydia felt her cheeks flush. But she persisted, her voice remaining steady despite the condescension. "If I could just show you the pattern of—" "Reeves, stick to what you know," Morrison cut her off firmly. "Torres has 15 years of hostage negotiation experience. Our tactical team has handled dozens of similar situations. We don't need theories from someone who spends her days staring at spreadsheets." Through the briefing room's windows, they could see the courthouse plaza where snipers had taken position on surrounding rooftops, their scopes glinting in the afternoon sun. The FBI's mobile command unit sat like a small fortress in the parking lot, bristling with communication equipment and surrounded by agents speaking urgently into radio handsets. But from Lydia's perspective, every standard procedure being implemented was actually making the situation more dangerous. The show of force was exactly the kind of response that would trigger someone acting out of personal grief and rage. The clinical procedural approach to negotiation would only confirm the militants' belief that the federal government saw them as faceless threats rather than human beings driven to desperation. She watched Agent Torres through the command unit's windows as he prepared for another contact attempt. Reading from a script developed by the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the words were perfectly calibrated for a standard hostage situation involving criminals seeking personal gain or publicity. They were completely wrong for someone like Dimitri's son, Alexander, who had watched his father die during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. "Ma'am," Lydia tried once more, her voice quieter but more urgent. "I really think we should consider that this might be about the Petrovic incident from—" "Enough," Morrison snapped. "Agent Walsh, please escort Miss Reeves to a different assignment. We need analysts who can follow directions, not wannabe profilers who think they understand international terrorism better than trained professionals." The dismissal stung, but it also confirmed what Lydia had suspected from the beginning of this crisis. Everyone in this room was operating from the same playbook, using the same assumptions, following the same procedures that worked perfectly for bank robbers and domestic extremists but would be catastrophically wrong for someone whose entire world had collapsed when his father was killed in training exercise that had gone horribly wrong. As she gathered her laptop and notes, preparing to be reassigned to some meaningless busy work, Lydia caught a fragment of radio chatter from the tactical team. "Sniper 2 has movement in the northeast window. Subject appears to be—" "Wait, that looks like a child." The blood drained from her face. A child changed everything. If Alexander Petrovic had brought his younger sister, Milena, the 8-year-old girl Lydia had helped evacuate from Sarajevo 3 years earlier, then this wasn't just about revenge for his father's death. It was about a desperate young man trying to protect the only family he had left, convinced that the same government forces that had killed his father would eventually come for her too. But as she looked around the room at the confident faces of federal agents preparing their tactical response, Lydia realized that nobody else understood what they were really dealing with. They saw armed terrorists holding hostages. She saw a broken family acting out of grief and terror, making choices that would end with everyone dead unless someone could bridge the gap between two completely different worlds. The secure phone on Morrison's desk rang with the harsh, electronic tone reserved for priority communications. The Deputy Assistant Director answered with crisp efficiency. "Morrison here." Even from across the room, Lydia could hear the tension in the voice on the other end. "Ma'am, we have a problem. The militants just broadcast another message, and this time they mentioned specific classified operation details that only someone with high-level clearance would know. We may be dealing with an insider threat." As Morrison's expression darkened and the room erupted into urgent whispered conversations about security breaches and intelligence leaks, Lydia quietly slipped out of the briefing room. She had work to do, and it had nothing to do with following protocols or waiting for permission from people who didn't understand what they were facing. Time was running out, and she was probably the only person in the building who knew what would actually stop the bloodshed that was coming. Lydia found herself reassigned to a cramped storage room 3 floors down, officially tasked with comprehensive background verification of all courthouse personnel present during the incident. It was busy work designed to keep her out of the way, and everyone knew it. Agent Walsh had made that clear when she'd handed over the assignment with barely concealed irritation. Cross-reference every employee, visitor, contractor, and delivery person who entered that building in the last 72 hours, Walsh had instructed. Look for anything suspicious, criminal records, financial irregularities, unusual travel patterns. And Reeves? Stay put. No wandering around asking questions that aren't your business. The storage room contained a single desk, an outdated computer terminal, and boxes of archived case files that smelled like dust and forgotten bureaucracy. But it also had something Lydia needed: a secure communication line that was monitored less frequently than the systems in the main briefing room. She spent the first hour actually completing her assigned task: cross-referencing courthouse personnel against various databases. It was methodical work that required genuine focus, but it also served as perfect cover while she used the terminal's secondary functions to access information that went far beyond employee background checks. The death of Colonel Dmitry Petrovic had been officially classified as an accident during a joint NATO training exercise in Montenegro. The after-action report, which Lydia accessed through channels that would raise uncomfortable questions if anyone noticed, painted a picture of equipment malfunction during a routine paratrooper exercise. Dmitry's parachute had failed to deploy properly, and he had died on impact. But Lydia remembered the real story. Because she had been there, the exercise had been a cover for a covert operation to extract a Serbian intelligence officer who had been providing information about arms trafficking through the Balkans. Dmitry hadn't been participating in paratrooper training. He had been the asset they were extracting. And his death hadn't been an accident. It had been an execution, carried out by his own handlers when they discovered he had been feeding information to both NATO intelligence and Serbian organized crime syndicates. Lydia had been part of the 5-person team that had gone in to bring Dmitry out. Her official title then had been Cultural Liaison Specialist, which was government speak for someone who could blend into local populations, speak the languages, and more importantly, convince desperate people to trust her with their lives. She had spent 2 weeks in Sarajevo, posing as a humanitarian aid worker while she built relationships with Dmitry's family, preparing them for extraction. She had sat at the kitchen table in their small apartment, drinking strong coffee and listening to Alexander, then 19, talk about his dreams of studying engineering in America. She had helped 8-year-old Milena with her English homework, patiently correcting her pronunciation while the girl's eyes lit up with each new word she mastered. She had promised them both that everything would be fine, that their father's cooperation with NATO forces would guarantee their safe passage to a new life. Then Dmitry had died, and everything had collapsed. The extraction had been called off immediately. Alexander and Milena had been left behind with no protection and no explanation, while their father's body was shipped home with a story about training accidents that nobody in their community believed. Within weeks, Serbian crime families had made it clear that the Petrovic children were considered liabilities, potential witnesses to their father's intelligence activities. Lydia had fought to get approval for an emergency extraction, but her superiors had determined that the political risks were too high. The operation was classified, the asset was dead, and 2 Serbian children didn't justify the diplomatic complications that would arise from admitting NATO involvement in Dmitry's activities. She had been ordered to return to Washington and never mention the Petrovic family again. Now, as she stared at the courthouse through the storage room's small window, watching federal agents implement textbook hostage response procedures, Lydia realized that Alexander hadn't forgotten her promise. Somewhere in that building, a young man who had once trusted her with his family's future was now convinced that the same government forces had betrayed him completely. The classified operation details that the militants had mentioned in their latest broadcast, those could only have come from someone with intimate knowledge of NATO intelligence activities in the Balkans, someone who had been there, who had seen how promises were made and broken, who understood exactly how expendable people like his family were considered to be. A soft knock on the storage room door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called, quickly minimizing the classified files on her screen. Agent Rebecca Santos entered, carrying a coffee cup and looking apologetic. Santos was relatively new to the intelligence division, fresh out of the FBI academy and still eager to prove herself. Unlike the senior agents, she hadn't yet developed the institutional arrogance that made them dismiss input from outside their narrow specialties. "I brought you coffee," Santos said, setting the cup on Lydia's desk. "Figured you might need it, stuck down here with all this paperwork." "Thanks," Lydia replied, genuinely grateful for the kindness. "Any updates from upstairs?" Santos glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. "Off the record? It's not going well. Torres tried another phone contact 20 minutes ago, and this time someone answered. Male voice, young, spoke perfect English, but with an accent. He didn't make any demands or threats, just asked if Agent Lydia Reeves was in the building. Lydia's blood turned to ice. He asked for me specifically. By name. Torres tried to find out why, but the guy hung up immediately. Morrison is freaking out, thinks you might be connected to this somehow. They're running a full security review on your background right now. The implications hit Lydia like a physical blow. If Morrison's team discovered her classified history with the Petrovic family, they would assume the worst, that she was somehow complicit in the attack, or at minimum a security liability who had compromised operational information. She would be arrested, questioned, and removed from any possibility of helping resolve the situation. More importantly, if Alexander was specifically asking about her, it meant he remembered their previous connection. It might also mean he was hoping she could provide answers that his government handlers had never given him. But every minute that passed without communication was pushing him closer to whatever desperate endgame he had planned. Agent Santos, Lydia said carefully, I need you to understand something. The standard negotiation protocols aren't going to work with these people. This isn't about money or politics or even revenge in the traditional sense. This is about a promise that was broken and people who have nothing left to lose. Santos frowned. What do you mean? How could you possibly know that? It was the question Lydia had been dreading. To explain how she knew would require revealing classified information that could end her career and potentially put her in federal prison. But looking out the window at the courthouse, where somewhere inside a desperate young man was holding innocent people hostage, while federal agents prepared to storm the building, she realized that her career was irrelevant compared to the lives at stake. Because I was there when the promise was made, she said quietly. And I was there when it was broken. Before Santos could respond, Lydia's terminal chimed with an incoming priority message. The text was brief and chilling. Security review complete. Agent Reeves to report to Deputy Assistant Director Morrison immediately for enhanced questioning regarding potential security breach. Lydia stared at the message, knowing that walking into that interrogation would end any chance she had of preventing the bloodbath that was coming. Morrison would want answers about her classified background, explanations for how the militants knew her name, and guarantees that she posed no security risk to the operation. All reasonable concerns from an institutional perspective, and all completely irrelevant to stopping Alexander from making a choice that would destroy whatever remained of his family. I can't go up there, she told Santos, her voice steady despite the gravity of what she was saying. Not yet. People are going to die if someone doesn't make contact with these militants soon, and I might be the only person in this building who understands what they really want. Santos looked alarmed. Reeves, you can't just ignore a direct order from a deputy assistant director. They'll arrest you for insubordination. Maybe worse if they think you're connected to this. Lydia was already gathering her things, her mind racing through possibilities and calculating risks. Morrison's interrogation could wait. Alexander's desperation could not. Agent Santos, she said, moving toward the door. In about 10 minutes. You're going to report that you delivered the message but couldn't find me. You're going to suggest that I might have gone to the bathroom, or stepped out for air, or any other reasonable explanation for a temporary absence. Can you do that for me?" Santos hesitated, clearly understanding that she was being asked to obstruct a federal investigation. "Lydia, what are you planning to do?" "Something that should have been done 3 years ago," Lydia replied. "I'm going to keep a promise." The confrontation came faster than Lydia had anticipated. She had barely made it to the building's main lobby when the elevator doors opened and Agent Walsh stepped out, flanked by 2 federal marshals in tactical gear. Their presence in the lobby wasn't coincidental. Morrison had clearly ordered a building-wide search when Lydia failed to report for her enhanced questioning. "Agent Reeves," Walsh called out sharply, her voice echoing off the marble walls of the federal building's grand entrance. "Stop right there. You're needed upstairs immediately." Several dozen federal employees and contractors who had been milling around the lobby during the lockdown turned to stare. The tension was palpable. Everyone knew something significant was happening with the hostage crisis. And seeing federal marshals escorting an intelligence analyst created exactly the kind of spectacle that Lydia had hoped to avoid. "I was just getting some air," Lydia said, adjusting her glasses nervously. "The storage room was getting stuffy, and I thought—" "Cut the act, Reeves," Walsh interrupted. "Morrison wants to see you now, and these gentlemen are here to make sure you don't take any more unauthorized breaks." The marshals stepped forward, their body language making it clear that this wasn't a request. Around the lobby, conversations had stopped entirely as people recognized the unmistakable dynamic of someone being detained. A few junior analysts from Lydia's department watched with obvious concern, while senior staff maintained carefully neutral expressions that suggested they were already distancing themselves from whatever scandal was unfolding. "Ma'am, I really think there's been a misunderstanding," Lydia said, her voice taking on the slightly panicked tone of someone who was in over their head. "I'm just an analyst. I don't understand why this is necessary." "The misunderstanding," said a new voice from behind the marshals, "is thinking we're stupid enough to believe your innocent act." Deputy Assistant Director Morrison emerged from the elevator, her expression cold and professional. She was flanked by 2 additional agents that Lydia didn't recognize, probably internal affairs investigators, brought in to handle what Morrison clearly suspected was a security breach involving insider collaboration. "Agent Reeves," Morrison continued, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "You are hereby relieved of all duties pending a comprehensive security investigation. You will surrender your credentials, your access cards, and any classified materials in your possession. Then you will accompany these officers for questioning regarding your potential connection to the ongoing hostage situation." The lobby had gone completely silent. Even the maintenance staff had stopped their work to watch the drama unfold. Lydia could feel dozens of eyes on her, measuring her reaction, judging whether she looked guilty or innocent, trying to understand how a quiet intelligence analyst had suddenly become the focus of federal law enforcement attention. "This is ridiculous," Lydia protested, but she made sure her voice cracked slightly, projecting the image of someone who was overwhelmed rather than defiant. "I've done nothing wrong. I've been doing exactly what Agent Walsh assigned me to do." "Really?" Morrison stepped closer, her voice dropping to a level that only the people immediately around them could hear. "Then explain how the leader of a terrorist cell knows your name. Explain how he has detailed knowledge of classified operations that you had access to. Explain why he's specifically asking to speak with you while holding federal officials hostage." Around the lobby, the whispers started immediately. The word terrorist carried with devastating effect, and Lydia could see the expressions on her colleagues' faces shifting from concern to suspicion to outright fear. A few people actually stepped back, as if proximity to her might somehow make them complicit in whatever crime she was suspected of committing. Agent Rodriguez from the Financial Crimes Unit, someone she had worked with regularly for the past 2 years, looked at her with undisguised shock. "Lydia, what the hell is going on?" he called out. "This can't be real." Before Lydia could respond, Agent Walsh held up a hand for silence. "Everyone back to your assigned areas. This is an ongoing investigation, and anyone who interferes or discusses this situation will face serious consequences." But the damage was already done. In the space of 5 minutes, Lydia had been transformed from a respected colleague into a suspected terrorist collaborator. The speed of the transformation was breathtaking and completely intentional. Morrison was using public humiliation as an interrogation technique, betting that social pressure and professional shame would break down whatever resistance. Lydia might have to revealing information about her connection to the hostage takers. "Ma'am," Lydia said, her voice now genuinely shaking with emotion, "I swear to you, I have no idea why anyone would ask for me by name. I've never been involved in anything like this. I just analyze financial data." "Financial data," Morrison repeated coldly, "including transactions related to Balkan criminal organizations, including wire transfers from shell companies with connections to Serbian intelligence services. How convenient that today's hostage crisis involves militants who seem very familiar with the region you specialize in." The implications were clear, and brilliantly crafted to sound damning, even though they were based on coincidences rather than evidence. Everyone listening would hear the suggestion that Lydia's legitimate work analyzing terrorist financing had somehow crossed the line into actual collaboration with the people she was supposed to be investigating. Dr. Jennifer Hayes, the senior intelligence coordinator who had always treated Lydia with professional respect, stepped forward hesitantly. "Morrison, I've worked with Agent Reeves for 3 years. She's one of our most reliable analysts. This seems—" "Dr. Hayes," Morrison cut her off sharply, "I appreciate your loyalty to your staff, but professional competence doesn't preclude personal compromise. Some of our most damaging security breaches have come from employees who appeared completely trustworthy right up until they weren't." The statement hung in the air like an accusation against everyone present. Morrison was reminding the entire lobby that suspecting colleagues of treason was not only acceptable but professionally necessary. The message was clear. Anyone who defended Lydia now would themselves become suspect. Agent Santos appeared at the edge of the crowd, her face pale with concern. She had clearly heard enough of the confrontation to understand that her decision to delay reporting Lydia's absence had backfired spectacularly. Now her new colleague was being accused of terrorism, and Santos herself might face questions about why she had failed to immediately relay Morrison's summons. "Agent Reeves," one of the federal marshals said formally, "you need to come with us now. Any resistance will result in additional charges." Lydia looked around the lobby at the faces of people she had worked with for 3 years. Some showed genuine concern. Others displayed the careful neutrality of federal employees who understood that careers could be destroyed by association with the wrong people. A few, particularly among the senior staff, looked relieved that someone else was being blamed for what was obviously a significant intelligence failure. "I want a lawyer," Lydia said quietly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I want a lawyer, and I want it on record that I am cooperating fully while maintaining my innocence of any wrongdoing." Morrison smiled coldly. "Of course you do. Just like every other insider threat we've ever investigated. The innocent ones always lawyer up immediately." It was a masterful psychological manipulation, designed to make Lydia's completely reasonable request for legal representation sound like evidence of guilt. Around the lobby, she could see people nodding slightly, buying into the narrative that only guilty people needed lawyers when talking to federal investigators. But as the marshals moved to escort her toward the elevator, Lydia realized that Morrison had made a critical error in choosing to conduct this confrontation publicly. By humiliating her in front of the entire building staff, Morrison had guaranteed that word of the arrest would spread immediately throughout the federal law enforcement community. Within hours, everyone would know that the hostage crisis involved an insider threat, that a federal intelligence analyst was suspected of collaboration with terrorists. More importantly, Morrison had revealed that the hostage-takers specifically knew Lydia's name and wanted to speak with her. That information would reach Alexander through news reports or law enforcement communications, confirming that she was in the building and available for contact. It would also tell him that federal authorities viewed her as a threat rather than a resource. As the elevator doors closed behind her and the marshals, Lydia realized that Morrison's public humiliation had actually provided her with something she desperately needed: credibility with the hostage-takers. When Alexander learned that she had been arrested and accused of terrorist collaboration, he would understand that she was no longer part of the official federal response. He might even believe that she was being punished for trying to help him. The irony was perfect. Morrison's attempt to destroy Lydia's credibility with her colleagues had actually enhanced her credibility with the one person whose trust she needed to save the lives of everyone in that courthouse. Now, she just had to find a way to use that credibility before federal investigators locked her away completely. The interrogation room on the 14th floor was designed to be intimidating: sterile white walls, fluorescent lighting that cast harsh shadows, and a metal table bolted to the floor. Lydia sat across from Morrison and the two internal affairs investigators, her hands clasped tightly in her lap as she waited for what she knew would be the most important conversation of her life. "Let's start simple," Morrison said, opening a thick file folder. 3 years ago, you were assigned to Operation Clearwater as a cultural liaison specialist. Your job was to establish contact with Serbian assets and facilitate their cooperation with NATO intelligence. Correct? Lydia nodded carefully. That's correct, though most of the operational details remain classified above my current clearance level. Don't play games with us. Reeves, snapped Agent David Kruger, one of the internal affairs investigators. We know you had direct contact with Dmitry Petrovic and his family. We know you spent 2 weeks in Sarajevo preparing them for extraction. What we want to know is why his son is now holding federal officials hostage and specifically asking for you by name. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Lydia had expected it, but hearing it spoken aloud in the stark interrogation room made the full scope of her situation brutally clear. Anything she said would either incriminate her as a security threat or reveal classified information that could end her career. Either way, while she sat here answering questions, innocent people were running out of time. I followed all protocols during that operation, Lydia said carefully. My contact with the Petrovic family was limited to what was necessary to gain their cooperation and prepare them for extraction. Extraction that never happened, Morrison pointed out coldly. Because Dmitry Petrovic was killed during what you claim was a training exercise. Interesting how convenient that death was for everyone except his family. Through the interrogation room's small window, Lydia could see news helicopters circling the courthouse plaza. The media had arrived in force, turning the hostage crisis into a public spectacle that would be broadcast around the world. She wondered if Alexander was watching the coverage, seeing how his desperate gambit was being portrayed as terrorism rather than the cry for justice it really represented. Agent Reeves, said the second internal affairs investigator, a stern woman named Agent Patricia Cole, we've reviewed your financial records, your travel history, and your communication patterns. Everything appears normal for someone in your position. That makes this situation even more concerning, because it suggests a level of operational security that goes beyond what an amateur would possess. The implication, was clear. They suspected she was a trained intelligence operative who had been turned by foreign assets. It would have been almost funny if innocent lives weren't hanging in the balance. The federal investigators were so focused on finding evidence of betrayal that they couldn't see the real story unfolding right in front of them. Morrison pulled out a transcript of radio communications. 47 minutes ago, the hostage-takers broadcast a message that included specific details about Operation Clearwater. Details that only someone with direct involvement would know. Can you explain how they obtained that information? Lydia stared at the transcript, recognizing immediately what Morrison was missing. The details Alexander had revealed weren't intelligence secrets he had obtained through espionage. They were personal memories, fragments of conversations he had overheard when his father thought he was asleep. Glimpses of classified documents he had seen in their family's apartment. Pieces of a puzzle that a grieving son had spent 3 years putting together. "Have you considered," Lydia said quietly, "that maybe he knows those details because he lived through that operation? Because his family was directly affected by decisions made in Washington conference rooms, by people who never had to look them in the eye?" Morrison's expression hardened. "So you admit you know him personally?" "I admit that I met him 3 years ago when his father was cooperating with NATO intelligence. I admit that I made promises to his family about their safety and their future. I admit that those promises were broken when the operation was terminated and they were abandoned." The room fell silent. Lydia could see the investigators processing her words, trying to determine if this was a confession of guilt or an explanation of circumstances beyond her control. But she also knew they were running out of time to make that determination. Agent Cole leaned forward. "What kind of promises?" "That their cooperation would be rewarded. That they would be protected from retaliation. That their father's sacrifice would mean something." Lydia's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. "Standard promises that we make to assets and their families. The kind of promises that get people killed when they're not kept." Morrison slammed her hand on the table. "Those decisions were made above your pay grade for reasons you don't understand. You had no authority to make promises about extraction or protection." "You're right," Lydia agreed. "I had no authority to make those promises. But I made them anyway, because a 19-year-old boy was terrified that his 8-year-old sister would be murdered by Serbian crime families who considered them liabilities. Because their father was risking his life to provide intelligence that saved American soldiers. Because it was the right thing to do." The admission hung in the air between them. Lydia had just confessed to exceeding her operational authority and making unauthorized commitments to foreign assets. In the bureaucratic world of federal intelligence, it was tantamount to admitting professional misconduct that could result in criminal charges, but it was also the truth. And everyone in the room knew it. Agent Kruger consulted his notes. According to the after-action reports, Dmitry Petrovic's death was investigated thoroughly. The conclusion was equipment malfunction during a routine training exercise. The conclusion, Lydia said carefully, was whatever was necessary to avoid diplomatic complications with the Serbian government. The truth was that Dmitry had been compromised and was killed to prevent him from revealing operational details to hostile intelligence services. Morrison's eyes narrowed. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because I was there when it happened. Because I saw his body. Because I was the one who had to explain to his children why their father wasn't coming home after all." The interrogation room's phone rang with the harsh electronic tone that indicated priority communications. Morrison answered it curtly. "Morrison here." Even from across the table, Lydia could hear the urgency in The question hung in the air like an accusation. Lydia had expected it, but hearing it spoken aloud in the stark interrogation room made the full scope of her situation brutally clear. Anything she said would either incriminate her as a security threat or reveal classified information that could end her career. Either way, while she sat here answering questions, innocent people were running out of time. I followed all protocols during that operation, Lydia said carefully. My contact with the Petrovic family was limited to what was necessary to gain their cooperation and prepare them for extraction. Extraction that never happened, Morrison pointed out coldly. Because Dmitry Petrovic was killed during what you claim was a training exercise. Interesting how convenient that death was for everyone except his family. Through the interrogation room's small window, Lydia could see news helicopters circling the courthouse plaza. The media had arrived in force, turning the hostage crisis into a public spectacle that would be broadcast around the world. She wondered if Alexander was watching the coverage, seeing how his desperate gambit was being portrayed as terrorism rather than the cry for justice it really represented. "Agent Reeves," said the second internal affairs investigator, "a stern woman named Agent Patricia Cole. We've reviewed your financial records, your travel history, and your communication patterns. Everything appears normal for someone in your position. That makes this situation even more concerning, because it suggests a level of operational security that goes beyond what an amateur would possess." The implication was clear. They suspected she was a trained intelligence operative who had been turned by foreign assets. It would have been almost funny if innocent lives weren't hanging in the balance. The federal investigators were so focused on finding evidence of betrayal that they couldn't see the real story unfolding right in front of them. Morrison pulled out a transcript of radio communications. 47 minutes ago, the hostage-takers broadcast a message that included specific details about Operation Clearwater. Details that only someone with direct involvement would know. Can you explain how they obtained that information? Lydia stared at the transcript, recognizing immediately what Morrison was missing. The details Alexander had revealed weren't intelligence secrets he had obtained through espionage. They were personal memories, fragments of conversations he had overheard when his father thought he was asleep. Glimpses of classified documents he had seen in their family's apartment. Pieces of a puzzle that a grieving son had spent 3 years putting together. "Have you considered," Lydia said quietly, "that maybe he knows those details because he lived through that operation? Because his family was directly affected by decisions made in Washington conference rooms, by people who never had to look them in the eye?" Morrison's expression hardened. "So you admit you know him personally?" "I admit that I met him 3 years ago when his father was cooperating with NATO intelligence. I admit that I made promises to his family about their safety and their future. I admit that those promises were broken when the operation was terminated and they were abandoned." The room fell silent. Lydia could see the investigators processing her words, trying to determine if this was a confession of guilt or an explanation of circumstances beyond her control. But she also knew they were running out of time to make that determination. Agent Cole leaned forward. "What kind of promises?" "That their cooperation would be rewarded. That they would be protected from retaliation. That their father's sacrifice would mean something." Lydia's voice remained steady, but her hands trembled slightly as she spoke. Emergency lighting kicked in immediately, bathing everything in a dim red glow that made the small space feel even more claustrophobic. Through the thick walls, she could hear the building's emergency systems activating, backup generators humming. To life, security doors engaging their magnetic locks, and the distant sound of federal agents shouting instructions over radio static. "Power outage in sectors 7 through 12, came a voice over the building's intercom system. "All personnel maintain positions until systems are restored. This is not a drill." But Lydia knew it wasn't a random power outage. The timing was too convenient, and the specific sectors affected were too precise. Someone with detailed knowledge of the building's infrastructure had deliberately triggered a localized blackout that would disable certain security systems while leaving others operational. Someone who understood that federal detention facilities had backup protocols that could be exploited by anyone familiar with emergency procedures. The heavy steel door to her cell made a soft electronic beep, followed by the distinctive click of magnetic locks disengaging. A moment later, the door swung open to reveal Agent Santos standing in the dimly lit hallway, her badge and service weapon clearly visible in the emergency lighting. "Agent Reeves," Santos said formally, her voice carrying enough volume to be heard by anyone who might be monitoring the corridor. "You're being transferred to a secure interview room for additional questioning at the request of Deputy Assistant Director Morrison." It was a perfect cover story, plausible enough that anyone overhearing would assume Santos was following official orders, detailed enough to explain why they would be moving through the building during an emergency situation. But the look in. Santos' eyes told Lydia everything she needed to know about the real nature of this transfer. "I understand," Lydia replied, stepping out of the cell with the careful compliance of someone who was genuinely being escorted by federal law enforcement. "Should I expect my attorney to be present for this questioning?" "All arrangements are being handled according to protocol," Santos answered, gesturing for Lydia to walk ahead of her down the hallway. "Given the ongoing emergency situation, some standard procedures may be modified." They moved through corridors that Lydia had never seen before, past storage rooms and mechanical spaces that comprised the building's hidden infrastructure. Santos navigated confidently through the maze of service passages, clearly working from detailed knowledge of the building's layout that went beyond what a junior agent would normally possess. "Agent Santos," Lydia said quietly as they walked, "I need you to understand what you're risking here. If Morrison discovers that I heard your interrogation," Santos interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything you said. About the Petrovic family, about the promises that were broken. I also heard the radio traffic about the security guard who was killed. That man had 3 kids and a granddaughter he was supposed to walk down the aisle next month." They paused at an intersection where 2 service corridors met. Santos checked her watch and consulted what appeared to be a maintenance schedule, timing their movement to avoid crossing paths with other personnel during the emergency response. "Alexander Petrovic isn't going to stop killing people until someone talks to him," Santos continued. "Morrison thinks she can end this with tactical teams and negotiation protocols, but she's wrong. You're the only person in this building who might be able to reach him before this gets worse." Lydia studied the young agent's face in the dim emergency lighting. "You're throwing away your career for someone you barely know, based on a conversation you overheard through a door. Why?" Santos was quiet for a moment, then pulled out her phone and showed Lydia a photo, a young man in military dress uniform, smiling broadly as he posed with Santos at what was clearly a graduation ceremony. "My brother Marcus graduated from West Point 3 years ago," Santos said softly. "He's been deployed to Afghanistan twice, Syria once. Every time he goes overseas, he relies on intelligence from assets whose names he'll never know, whose faces he'll never see. People who risk their lives to provide information that keeps American soldiers alive." She put the phone away and looked directly at Lydia. "If something happened to Marcus because we abandoned someone who had helped us, because we broke our promises to people who trusted us, I'd want someone to step up and do the right thing, even if it meant breaking rules." They reached a service elevator that Santos accessed with a maintenance keycard. As they rode up toward the main floors, Lydia realized that Santos had thought through every aspect of this operation with remarkable sophistication. The power outage had been timed to coincide with shift changes in building security. The route through service corridors avoided areas with active surveillance during emergency situations. Even the cover story about additional questioning was designed to buy them maximum time before anyone realized what was actually happening. "How long do we have before they notice I'm missing?" Lydia asked. "Maybe an hour before Morrison orders a security sweep. Maybe less if she decides to check on you personally." Santos consulted her phone, which was displaying what appeared to be real-time building security status. The power outage will be restored in 15 minutes, which will reactivate the detention facility's monitoring systems. We need to be well away from there before that happens. The elevator stopped at the building's main level, in a section that connected to the plaza through a series of service tunnels originally designed for deliveries and maintenance access. Santos led them through another maze of passages, past rooms filled with Havok equipment and electrical panels that hummed with the steady rhythm of institutional machinery. "Agent Santos," Lydia said as they approached what appeared to be an external access door, "I need you to know that what we're about to do could go very wrong. If I can't reach Alexander, if he's too far gone to listen to reason, people are going to die, including me." Santos paused with her hand on the door's security panel. "And if we don't try, people are definitely going to die. Starting with the civilians in that courthouse and ending with a tactical assault that will turn this plaza into a war zone." Through the steel door, they could hear the distant sounds of the ongoing crisis: helicopter rotors, shouted commands, the electronic chatter of radio communications. Santos entered a code into the security panel, and the door's locks disengaged with a soft mechanical click. "There's a service tunnel that runs under the plaza," Santos explained. "It connects this building to the courthouse's basement level. Maintenance crews use it to service the shared utility systems. The tunnel isn't monitored by security cameras, and during an active hostage situation, it won't be patrolled." Lydia stared at her. "You've planned this down to the last detail. This isn't a spontaneous decision, is it?" Santos smiled grimly. "I've been watching this crisis unfold for 8 hours, listening to senior agents talk about acceptable casualties and tactical solutions. I've been thinking about what my brother would do if he were here, what he'd want me to do. The plan came together about 20 minutes ago, when I realized that someone needed to actually try to save those people instead of just managing the political fallout." They stepped through the door into a concrete tunnel that stretched beneath the plaza like an urban cave system. Emergency lighting cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the air carried the faint smell of machinery oil and cleaning chemicals. In the distance, they could hear the muffled sounds of federal agents preparing for what everyone seemed to assume would be a violent resolution. As they walked through the tunnel toward the courthouse, Lydia felt the weight of what she was about to attempt. She was going to walk into a building filled with armed, desperate people who had already killed once and were prepared to kill again. She had no weapons, no backup, no official authority, and no guarantee that Alexander would even remember her well enough to trust her. But she also knew that upstairs in the federal building, Morrison and her team were preparing a tactical assault that would end with everyone in the courthouse dead. They were treating this as a standard terrorist incident that could be resolved through superior firepower and professional procedures. They couldn't see that sometimes the only way to prevent a tragedy was to trust the very people that institutional protocol demanded they exclude. "Agent Santos," Lydia said as they approached the tunnel's end, "after today, your career in federal law enforcement is probably over. Morrison will make sure you never work in government again." Santos shrugged. "Maybe, but at least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. And maybe my brother will be proud that his sister chose to be a federal agent who actually protected people instead of just following orders." Ahead of them, a maintenance access door marked "Courthouse Basement, Authorized Personnel Only," glowed softly in the emergency lighting. Beyond that door waited Alexander Petrovic and whatever remained of the scared young man Lydia had known 3 years ago. It was time to keep a promise that should have been kept long ago. The courthouse basement was a labyrinth of mechanical rooms, storage areas, and service corridors that stretched beneath the building like a concrete maze. Emergency lighting cast long shadows between massive HVAC units and electrical panels, creating a surreal landscape of industrial machinery humming with quiet efficiency despite the chaos unfolding in the floors above. Lydia moved carefully through the basement. following Santos' hastily sketched map toward the service elevator that would take them to the main floor. Every sound seemed amplified in the confined space, the distant rumble of helicopters overhead, the muffled voices of tactical teams positioning themselves outside, and somewhere above them, the terrifying silence of hostages who knew their lives hung by an increasingly fragile thread. "The elevator should be just past the main electrical room," Santos whispered, consulting her phone's flashlight to read the building schematics she had downloaded. According to the maintenance records, it opens directly into the courthouse's central lobby. As they rounded a corner past a room filled with water heaters and filtration equipment, Lydia suddenly stopped. Through the concrete walls, she could hear something that made her blood run cold. A child crying. Not the normal tears of fear or confusion, but the desperate, hiccuping sobs of someone who had witnessed something terrible. "That's Milena," she said quietly, recognizing the distinctive pitch of the 8-year-old girl's voice, even after 3 years. Alexander brought his sister with him. Santos looked alarmed. "A child?" The intelligence briefings said 6 adult militants. There was no mention of children being involved. "Because Alexander doesn't think of himself as a militant," Lydia explained. "He thinks of himself as a protector. He brought Milena because he believes the same government forces that killed his father will eventually come for her too. In his mind, keeping her close is the only way to keep her safe." The sound of the child's crying grew louder as they approached the service elevator. Through the building's ventilation system, they could also hear fragments of adult conversation in accented English, urgent, frightened voices discussing ammunition counts and defensive positions. But underneath the tactical planning, Lydia caught something else, the tone of people who were terrified and running out of hope. Santos activated the elevator with her maintenance access card, and they rode up in tense silence. The elevator opened directly into a storage closet adjacent to the courthouse's main lobby, exactly as the building schematics had indicated. Through the closet's door, they could hear the hostage situation unfolding just meters away. Double quotes. Told you, federal agents. "We want to speak with Agent Lydia Reeves," came a young man's voice, speaking with careful precision despite obvious stress. "You have 15 minutes to produce her, or another hostage dies." Lydia's heart clenched at the sound. Alexander's voice was deeper now, hardened by 3 years of grief and anger. But she could still hear echoes of the 19-year-old boy who had asked her endless questions about life in America while she helped his family prepare for extraction. "We're working on locating Agent Reeves," came the response, through a bullhorn from outside the building. "She's currently unavailable, but we have other experienced negotiators who can help resolve this situation." "No," Alexander replied, his voice carrying a finality that made everyone in the lobby freeze. "No more lies. No more promises from people who don't keep their word. Lydia Reeves made promises to my family. She will come here and explain why those promises were broken, or innocent people will pay the price for your government's betrayals." Santos looked at Lydia with obvious concern. "He sounds like he's already made peace with dying." "That's the most dangerous kind of hostage-taker." "He has made peace with dying," Lydia confirmed. "But not with his sister dying. That's our opening." She took a deep breath and opened the storage closet door. The courthouse lobby spread before them, a grand space with marble floors, tall windows, and elegant columns that had been transformed into a fortress. Overturned furniture created defensive barriers, and she could see at least 4 armed figures positioned at strategic points around the room. In the center of the lobby, 12 hostages sat on the floor in a tight group, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. They included courthouse staff, attorneys, and civilians who had been unfortunate enough to be conducting business when the siege began. Their faces showed the strain of hours spent in terror, wondering if each moment might be their last. Deputy Director Harrison Kelloway sat slightly apart from the other hostages, his expensive suit torn and his face showing signs of physical abuse. As the specific target of this operation, he had clearly received special attention from his captors. But he was alive, which meant Alexander still needed him for something. And there, sitting on a wooden bench near the information desk, was Milena Petrovic. She had grown in the 3 years since Lydia had last seen her, but she was unmistakably the same little girl who had practiced English words at the kitchen table in their Sarajevo apartment. Now 11 years old, she clutched a small stuffed animal and watched the armed strangers around her with the blank stare of someone who had seen too much violence for her young mind to process. Alexander stood near the main entrance, an assault rifle held with professional competence as he monitored the federal agents positioning themselves outside. At 22, he had developed the lean, hardened physique of someone who had spent years preparing for conflict. His face bore the haunted expression of someone who had lost everything that mattered to him and was now determined to extract payment for that loss. But when he turned slightly, scanning the lobby for potential threats, Lydia saw something that gave her hope. Despite everything that had happened, despite the violence he had already committed, Alexander's eyes kept returning to his sister. Every few seconds, he would glance at Milena to make sure she was safe, to reassure himself that she was still within his protection. The love and desperate protectiveness in those glances told Lydia that the boy she had known was still alive, somewhere inside the young man who had become a killer. "Alexander," she called out, stepping into the lobby with her hands clearly visible and empty. "It's me. It's Lydia." Every gun in the room swung toward her. The hostages gasped in terror, thinking they were about to witness another execution. Santos, who had remained hidden in the storage closet, held her breath as she watched Lydia walk calmly into what appeared to be certain death, but Alexander lowered his weapon, his face cycling through emotions too complex to name. Recognition, hope, rage, betrayal, and something that might have been relief all flickered across his features as he stared at the woman who had vanished from his life 3 years ago without explanation. "You came," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "They said you were in the building, but I didn't believe it. I thought it was another lie." "I came," Lydia confirmed, walking slowly toward the center of the lobby. "I should have come 3 years ago. I should never have left you and Milena alone." One of Alexander's companions, a man in his 30s with the tactical bearing of former military, raised his rifle nervously. "Alex, this could be a trap. She could be wired, or they could have snipers." "No," Alexander said firmly, never taking his eyes off Lydia. "This is the woman I told you about. The one who made promises to our family. The one who disappeared when my father died." Milena looked up from her stuffed animal, her eyes widening as recognition dawned. "Miss Lydia?" she said in accented English that was much better than it had been 3 years ago. "Is it really you?" The sound of the child's voice saying her name broke something inside Lydia's chest. She had spent 3 years trying to forget these children, trying to convince herself that they had found safety somehow, that her abandonment of them hadn't condemned them to a life of fear and desperation. Now she saw the truth. Her broken promises had led directly to this moment, to a courthouse full of terrified hostages and a young man who had chosen violence because it was the only language that seemed to get responses from the people who had betrayed him. "Yes, sweetie," Lydia said, kneeling down so she was at Milena's eye level. "It's really me. I'm so sorry I stayed away for so long." Around the lobby, the other militants watched this reunion with obvious confusion. They had expected a confrontation, a negotiation, perhaps even a trick designed to distract them while tactical teams prepared to assault the building. They hadn't expected their leader to be reduced to tears by the sight of a woman who looked more like a librarian than a federal agent, but Alexander was crying, silent tears that spoke of 3 Years of grief and anger finally finding an outlet. "Why did you leave us?" he asked, his voice cracking with the pain of someone who had been abandoned by the only person who had ever offered his family hope. "You promised you would take care of us. You promised we would be safe. Then Father died, and you vanished, and we had nothing." It was the moment Lydia had been dreading for 3 years. The moment when she would have to explain to a grieving young man that his father's death had been expedient for everyone except the family he left behind. That political considerations had outweighed moral obligations. That promises made to foreign assets and their families were considered operational tools rather than sacred commitments. But looking at Alexander's tear-stained face, and at Milena's confused expression as she tried to understand why the adults around her were so upset, Lydia realized that the truth, however painful, was the only thing that might save everyone in this room. "I left because I was ordered to leave," she said quietly, "and because I was a coward who chose to follow orders instead of keeping promises." The courthouse lobby fell into complete silence as Lydia's admission hung in the air. Even the tactical radio chatter from outside seemed to fade as everyone processed what she had just said. Alexander stared at her with an expression that mixed vindication with fresh pain, the confirmation that his family's abandonment had been deliberate rather than accidental somehow made it both better and worse. "You were ordered to abandon us," he repeated slowly, testing the words. "By who?" "By the same government that promised my father protection in exchange for risking his life." Lydia nodded, her throat tight with emotion. "By people who never met you or Milena. People who saw your family as operational assets rather than human beings. When your father died and the political situation became complicated, the decision was made to terminate all contact and deny any connection to the operation." One of Alexander's companions, a woman with short dark hair and the bearing of former intelligence services, stepped forward. "Alex, we don't have time for this. The federal agents outside are positioning for assault. This emotional reunion is exactly what they want, to distract us while they prepare to attack." But Alexander raised a hand to silence her, never taking his eyes off Lydia. "Tell me about my father's death. The truth this time, not the story about equipment malfunction during training exercises." Lydia glanced around the lobby, aware that every word she spoke was being monitored by federal agents outside. Revealing classified operational details could result in treason charges, but withholding them would almost certainly result in the deaths of everyone in this room. "Your father was compromised," she said quietly. "Serbian intelligence discovered that he was providing information to NATO forces. He was supposed to be extracted before they could act on that knowledge, but the extraction was delayed because of political concerns about operating on Serbian soil without official permission." "Political concerns," Alexander said bitterly. "My father's life was less important than avoiding diplomatic complications." "Yes," Lydia confirmed, the simple word carrying the weight of 3 years of guilt. "The decision was made at levels far above my authority. By the time I learned that the extraction had been canceled, your father was already dead." Deputy Director Kelloway, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, finally spoke up. "Agent Reeves, you are revealing classified information about ongoing intelligence operations. I order you to stop this conversation immediately." Alexander turned toward him with cold fury. "You order her? You're in no position to order anyone anything. You're here to answer for your government's crimes, not to issue commands." The hostages around Kelloway shrank back as Alexander approached, his rifle held with casual competence. But instead of threatening the deputy director, he knelt down next to Milena and spoke to her in rapid Serbian. The little girl nodded and moved to a different bench, farther from the potential line of fire. "My sister doesn't need to hear the details of what your people did to our family," Alexander explained, returning his attention to Lydia. But she deserves to know why we've been living like fugitives for 3 years. Why we've had to change our names and move constantly to stay ahead of people who want us dead. Lydia felt the pieces of the story falling into place with horrifying clarity. You've been hiding from Serbian organized crime. They blamed your family for your father's intelligence activities. Not just Serbian crime families, interjected the dark-haired woman. NATO intelligence marked them as potential security risks after Dimitri's death. Too much knowledge, too many connections, too unpredictable. Both sides wanted them eliminated or controlled. Alexander nodded grimly. We became orphans in every sense of the word. No government would protect us, no organization would trust us. No place was safe for more than a few months at a time. The only thing that kept us alive was staying ahead of everyone who wanted us dead. Through the courthouse windows, Lydia could see federal tactical teams moving into position. Snipers were establishing fields of fire from surrounding buildings, while assault teams prepared to storm the entrances. The standard hostage rescue protocols were being implemented with mechanical precision, based on assumptions about terrorist motivations that were completely wrong. Alexander, she said urgently, you have to understand that the people outside don't know your story. They see armed militants holding federal officials hostage. They're preparing to end this with force, and when they do, everyone in here will die, including Milena. I know, Alexander replied with devastating calm. I've always known how this would end. The only question was whether anyone would ever acknowledge what was done to my family, or if we would just disappear like we never existed. He gestured toward Deputy Director Kelloway. He signed the termination orders for Operation Clearwater. He personally authorized the abandonment of my family after my father's death. I brought him here because he needs to explain those decisions to the families of the people who are going to die because of them. Kelloway's face had gone pale as he realized the full scope of what was happening. That operation was classified. How could you possibly know about my involvement? Because I spent 3 years learning everything I could about the people who destroyed my family, Alexander answered. I studied your careers, your decision-making patterns, your personal lives. I know about your daughter who just started college, your wife who volunteers at the animal shelter, your son who wants to follow in your footsteps at the State Department. The threat was implicit, but unmistakable. Alexander wasn't just seeking justice for past wrongs. He was prepared to inflict personal consequences on the people he held responsible for his families. Suffering, Lydia realized that the situation was even more desperate than she had thought. This wasn't random terrorism or even politically motivated violence. It was the culmination of 3 years of grief, rage, and careful planning by someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Alexander, she said carefully, your father risked his life because he believed in something bigger than himself. He provided intelligence that saved American soldiers' lives. He helped prevent attacks that would have killed innocent people. His death was tragic, but his work had meaning. His work had meaning to your government as long as it was useful, Alexander corrected her. The moment it became inconvenient, his sacrifice was forgotten and his family was expendable. Just like the families of every other asset who trusted American promises. One of his companions was monitoring radio communications on a handheld scanner. Alex, they're giving final tactical briefings outside. Assault teams are moving to breach positions. We have maybe 10 minutes before they come through those doors. Alexander checked his watch and nodded. Then it's time to finish this conversation. Lydia, I need you to explain something to me. When you made promises to my family 3 years ago, did you believe them? Or did you know from the beginning that you were lying? The question cut straight to the heart of Lydia's guilt. She had known that promises made to assets and their families were contingent on operational success and political convenience. She had known that her government's commitment to protecting foreign nationals was limited and conditional. But she had also seen the hope in Alexander's eyes when she talked about their future in America. The excitement in Milena's voice when she practiced English words that would help her in American schools. I believed them when I made them, she said honestly. I wanted them to be true. But I also knew that I didn't have the authority to guarantee them. So you gave us hope that you knew might be false, Alexander said. You made my sister dream about a life that might never exist. You convinced my father that his sacrifice would be honored. And when those hopes were destroyed, you disappeared rather than facing the consequences of your promises. Every word hit Lydia like a physical blow, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. Yes, I did all of those things. And I've spent 3 years trying to justify those choices, trying to convince myself that I was just following orders and doing my job. But the truth is that I failed your family in every way that mattered. Around the lobby, the other militants watched this confrontation with obvious tension. They had come here expecting to die for their cause, but none of them had anticipated the complex emotions involved in confronting someone who bore personal responsibility for their leader's grief. Milena, who had been sitting quietly on her bench, suddenly stood up and walked toward Lydia, despite the weapons and the tension and the approaching tactical teams. She moved with the fearless confidence of a child who still believed adults could fix problems if they really tried. Miss Lydia, she said in careful English, are you going to help us this time? Or are you going to leave again? The question was asked with such innocent directness that it cut through all the political complexity and operational justifications. An 11-year-old girl was asking this simplest possible question. Would the adult who had promised to protect her actually keep that promise, or would she abandon them again when things became difficult? Looking into Milena's eyes, Lydia realized that this was the moment she had been unconsciously preparing for since the day she walked away from the Petrovic family. Everything that had happened since, her civilian career, her careful anonymity, her attempts to forget her past, had been leading to this choice between institutional loyalty and personal integrity. I'm going to help you, she said firmly, addressing both Milena and Alexander. But I need you to trust me one more time, even though I know I don't deserve that trust. Alexander studied her face with the intensity of someone who had learned that trust could be fatal. What are you proposing? I'm proposing that we find a way to end this that doesn't result in your sister growing up as an orphan, Lydia replied. Because that's what's going to happen if federal agents storm this building. Milena will lose the only family she has left, and she'll spend the rest of her life wondering if there was another way. For the first time since she had entered the courthouse, Alexander's expression softened slightly as he looked at his sister. The love and protectiveness in that glance told Lydia everything she needed to know about his true priorities. What did you have in mind? He asked quietly. I need you to release half the hostages immediately, Lydia said, her voice carrying a new authority that surprised everyone in the room. Starting with the courthouse employees who have nothing to do with government intelligence operations. Keep Deputy Director Kelloway and 2 others. That will show the tactical teams outside that you're negotiating in good faith. Alexander's companions exchanged skeptical glances. The dark-haired woman, who had introduced herself only as Vera, stepped closer to their leader. This is exactly what federal negotiators would propose. Reduce the number of hostages while maintaining tactical advantage. How do we know this isn't a standard manipulation technique? Because, Lydia replied, looking directly at Vera, standard manipulation techniques don't involve federal agents walking into hostile territory without backup or authorization. Because I'm not here as a government representative. I'm here as someone who owes this family a debt that can never be fully repaid. She gestured toward the windows where they could see snipers adjusting their positions on nearby rooftops. The assault teams outside are following protocols designed for terrorists who want to die for their cause. They're preparing to storm this building and eliminate all threats, regardless of civilian casualties. The only way to prevent that is to change their tactical assessment. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, studying Lydia's face for any sign of deception. Finally, he turned to his team and spoke in rapid Serbian. A heated discussion followed, with Vera clearly arguing against any concessions while the other militants seemed torn between tactical caution and trust in their leader's judgment. "My team thinks you're trying to divide our forces," Alexander said eventually. "They believe that releasing hostages will only make it easier for tactical teams to justify an assault." "Your team is partially right," Lydia admitted. "Releasing hostages will change the tactical situation. But it will also prove to the commanders outside that you're capable of rational decision-making rather than suicidal fanaticism. Right now, they're treating this as a terrorist incident that can only end in violence. We need to show them it's actually a political crisis that might be resolved through negotiation." Deputy Director Kelloway, who had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation, finally spoke up. "Agent Reeves, you are not authorized to conduct negotiations on behalf of the United States government. Any agreements you make here will not be honored by federal authorities." Alexander turned toward him with cold fury. "Your government's promises aren't worth the paper they're written on anyway. We've learned that lesson already." But Lydia held up a hand to forestall further argument. "Director Kelloway is right about my lack of authorization. But he's wrong about something more important. This isn't about government agreements or official policies. This is about human beings making choices that they can live with." She looked around the lobby at the terrified hostages, the armed militants preparing for what they believed would be their final battle, and most importantly, at Nolina sitting quietly on her bench while adults argued about her future. "Alexander, you brought your sister here because you believed it was the only way to protect her from people who wanted her dead. But if this ends in a tactical assault, she'd die anyway. The only difference is that she'd die watching you get killed first." The brutal honesty of the statement hit everyone in the room like a physical blow. Nolina looked up from her stuffed animal, clearly understanding enough English to grasp that the adults were discussing her death. "Miss Lydia," she said in a small voice, "I don't want Alex to die. I don't want anyone to die." The sound of the child's voice saying those words in the middle of an armed standoff created a moment of absolute clarity for everyone present. Whatever political grievances or personal vendettas had led to this confrontation, an 11-year-old girl was asking for the one thing that seemed impossible: for everyone to live. Alexander knelt down next to his sister and spoke to her gently in Serbian. She nodded and hugged her stuffed animal tighter. But her eyes remained fixed on Lydia with the kind of trust that only children could offer to adults who had already failed them once. "If I release hostages," Alexander said finally, "what guarantee do I have that tactical teams won't use the opportunity to assault the building?" "None," Lydia replied honestly. "I can't control what happens outside this building. But I can give you my word that I'll do everything in my power to prevent unnecessary bloodshed." "Your word," Vera said bitterly. "The same word you gave 3 years ago when you promised to protect their family?" The accusation stung because it was entirely accurate. Lydia had no institutional authority, no official backing, and no way to enforce any agreements she might make. She was asking desperate people to trust someone who had already betrayed them, based on nothing more than personal commitment and moral conviction. "Yes," she said simply. "My word, which I broke once and have regretted every day since. Which I'm offering again because it's the only thing I have left to give." Through the courthouse windows, they could see federal agents receiving new instructions through their radio headsets. The assault preparations were entering their final phase, which meant they had minutes rather than hours to change the trajectory of this crisis. Alexander made his decision with the swift certainty of someone who had spent years learning to survive on instinct. "Vera, select 6 hostages for release. Courthouse employees only, no federal personnel." Make sure they understand that any attempt at communication with tactical teams will result in immediate retaliation against the remaining hostages. Vera looked like she wanted to argue, but she recognized the tone of finality in her leader's voice. She moved efficiently through the group of hostages, selecting individuals based on criteria that seemed to combine tactical considerations with genuine humanitarian concern. Within minutes, 6 terrified courthouse employees were escorted to the main entrance. Alexander himself opened the heavy doors and spoke clearly toward the federal positions outside. These people are being released as a gesture of good faith. They are not carrying messages or intelligence. Any attempt to use their release as cover for tactical operations will be considered a violation of negotiating protocol and will result in immediate consequences for the remaining hostages. The released hostages stumbled out into the plaza, where they were immediately surrounded by federal agents and medical personnel. Through the building's windows, everyone could see the intense debriefing sessions as intelligence officers tried to extract tactical information about the militants' positions, weapons, and intentions. "Now what?" asked one of Alexander's companions, a younger man who had been nervously monitoring the approaches to the building. "Now we find out if federal agents are capable of honoring agreements made by someone without official authority," Alexander replied. "And we find out if Lydia Reeves has learned anything about keeping promises in the 3 years since she abandoned my family." The radio scanner in Vera's hands crackled with encrypted federal communications. Even though the specific words were unclear, the tone and urgency suggested that the hostage release had indeed changed the tactical situation outside. Assault teams were receiving new orders, and command personnel were reassessing their options. But Lydia knew that the release of 6 hostages had only bought them time, not safety. The fundamental problem remained unchanged. Federal authorities still viewed this as a terrorist incident that required a forceful resolution. Unless she could convince them otherwise, the tactical assault would proceed as planned, just with fewer civilian casualties to justify. "Alexander," she said urgently, "releasing the hostages was the first step. Now we need to take the second step, giving the people outside a reason to believe that negotiation is possible." "What kind of reason?" "Information," Lydia replied. "Specific intelligence about the Serbian crime families who have been hunting your family. Names, locations, operational details. Something valuable enough that federal authorities will want to keep you alive long enough to debrief you properly." Vera looked up sharply from her radio scanner. "You're asking him to become an informant again, just like his father." "I'm asking him to use the intelligence he's gathered over 3 years of survival to protect his sister's future," Lydia corrected. "The same intelligence that got him into this building undetected, that enabled him to plan this operation, that kept his family alive when both governments and crime syndicates wanted them dead." It was a dangerous proposition for multiple reasons. Offering to cooperate with federal authorities might be seen as weakness by Alexander's companions, but refusing to offer anything of value would ensure that tactical teams treated him as nothing more than a target to be eliminated. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that all carried terrible risks. Finally, he looked at Milena and made the choice that had been driving all of his decisions for 3 years. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "I'm proposing a formal debriefing session," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was suggesting. "You provide detailed intelligence about Balkan organized crime networks in exchange for federal protection for your sister and asylum considerations for your entire team." Alexander studied her face carefully. "And how exactly would this debriefing take place?" "With tactical teams positioned to storm the building the moment I lower my weapon." Before Lydia could respond, Deputy Director Kelloway interrupted with obvious alarm. Agent Reeves, you have absolutely no authority to negotiate asylum agreements or protection arrangements. The State Department handles asylum requests through established legal channels, not through hostage negotiations. Director Kelloway, Lydia replied coolly. With respect, your departmental procedures are what created this crisis in the first place. Sometimes the only way to fix broken systems is to work around them entirely. She turned back to Alexander. Here's what I'm proposing. A live video conference with senior federal officials, broadcast simultaneously to news media outlets. You provide preliminary intelligence about organized crime activities while negotiating the specific terms of your family's protection. The public nature of the negotiation makes it impossible for either side to later deny the agreements that are reached. Vera looked up from her radio scanner with obvious skepticism. Public negotiations also make it impossible to include certain types of information. Intelligence agencies don't discuss operational details on live television. Exactly, Lydia agreed. Which means Alexander would be providing general intelligence about criminal activities rather than classified operational details. Information that helps federal law enforcement without compromising ongoing intelligence operations. One of Alexander's younger companions, who had been quietly monitoring the building's entrances, stepped forward. This sounds like another trap. They get valuable intelligence, then claim the agreements were made under duress and refuse to honor them. But Alexander was already thinking through the implications of Lydia's proposal. Public negotiations would create political pressure to honor any agreements. Federal officials can't easily abandon promises made on live television without facing media scrutiny and congressional oversight. Through the courthouse windows, they could see news crews setting up additional equipment in the plaza. The hostage crisis had attracted national media attention, with reporters from major networks broadcasting live updates every hour. The presence of so many cameras and journalists had actually complicated the tactical response, since any assault on the building would be witnessed by millions of viewers. The media attention is both an opportunity and a risk, Lydia explained. It prevents federal authorities from using excessive force because they know everything will be recorded and analyzed. But it also means that any intelligence you provide will become public knowledge, which could put your sources or contacts at risk. Alexander walked to the window and studied the scene outside. Federal agents in tactical gear, news crews with satellite trucks, crowds of curious civilians being held back by police barriers. After years of hiding in shadows and moving constantly to stay ahead of various threats, the idea of conducting negotiations in full public view carried a strange appeal. "Milena," he said in Serbian, "come here for a moment." His sister approached cautiously, still clutching her stuffed animal. Alexander knelt down and spoke to her quietly in their native language, explaining something that made her nod seriously several times. When he finished, she looked at Lydia with the same direct gaze that had characterized all of their previous interactions. "Alex says you want to help us talk to the people outside," Milena said in careful English. "He says they might listen if we tell them about the bad men who have been chasing us." The simple clarity of the child's understanding cut through all the complex political and tactical considerations. From Milena's perspective, this was simply about getting help from adults who had the power to stop the bad men, who had made her family's life a nightmare for 3 years. "That's right, sweetie," Lydia confirmed. "Sometimes adults need to hear the whole story before they understand how to help." Deputy Director Kelloway, who had been listening to this exchange with growing frustration, finally exploded. "This is absolutely insane. You're proposing to negotiate with terrorists using a child as an emotional prop. Agent Reeves, I order you to step away from these people immediately and surrender yourself to federal custody." The outburst revealed more about Kelloway's mindset than he probably intended. To him, Alexander was simply a terrorist who had taken hostages to advance a political agenda. The personal history, the broken promises, The family's desperate struggle for survival. None of that mattered compared to institutional procedures and bureaucratic authority. Alexander's response was immediate and devastating. Director Kelloway, my terrorist agenda consists of trying to keep my 11-year-old sister alive. Your government marked us for death when my father became inconvenient, and now you're angry that we refuse to die quietly. He gestured toward the hostages still sitting on the floor. These people are alive because I need witnesses to what really happened to my family. You're alive because someone needs to explain why federal promises aren't worth the paper they're written on. But don't mistake my restraint for weakness or my sister's presence for manipulation. Vera had been monitoring federal communications throughout this conversation, and now she looked up with urgent concern. Alex, they're moving tactical teams into final positions. I'm hearing references to imminent breach authorization and acceptable casualty parameters. We may have less time than we thought. The information galvanized everyone in the room. Whatever negotiations might be possible, they needed to happen immediately before federal authorities decided that the tactical solution was preferable to continued uncertainty. Alexander, Lydia said urgently, if we're going to try this, it has to happen now. Once assault teams receive final authorization, there won't be any opportunity for negotiation. He was quiet for a moment, weighing the impossible choice between certain death and uncertain hope. Finally, he looked at his team with the expression of someone who had carried responsibility for other people's lives far longer than anyone his age should have to. If we do this, there's no going back, he told them in English so that Lydia could understand. We'll be trusting people who have already betrayed us once, hoping that public pressure will force them to honor agreements that they could easily break later. The alternative is dying here in the next hour, Vera pointed out pragmatically. At least this way, Milena has a chance. One by one, his companions nodded their agreement. They had followed Alexander into what they all assumed would be a suicide mission, motivated by loyalty and shared grief rather than hope for survival. The possibility of actually living through this crisis was something none of them had seriously considered. Miss Lydia, Milena said quietly, if we talk to the people outside, will they promise not to hurt Alex? It was the question that lay at the heart of everything, whether federal authorities would be willing to treat Alexander as something other than a terrorist who deserved only punishment. Whether the system that had abandoned his family 3 years ago had any capacity for acknowledging its mistakes and making amends. I can't make that promise, sweetie, Lydia said honestly. But I can promise that I'll do everything possible to make sure they understand that Alex has been trying to protect you, not hurt other people. Alexander made his final decision with the swift certainty that had kept his family alive through 3 years of impossible circumstances. Set up the video conference, he told Lydia. But understand this, if federal authorities use this negotiation as cover for an assault, if they break any agreements made during public discussions, the consequences will be on your conscience as much as theirs. It was a terrible responsibility to accept, but Lydia realized that she had been carrying that responsibility since the day she walked away from the Petrovic family. The only question now was whether she could finally use it to save the lives she should have protected 3 years ago. I understand, she said. Let's make the call that should have been made a long time ago. The video conference took place on the courthouse's main computer terminal, with news cameras positioned to capture both the federal officials in Washington and the scene inside the lobby. Within 30 minutes, Lydia had managed to arrange a 3-way call connecting Alexander, Deputy Assistant Director Morrison, and Attorney General Patricia Hawthorne herself, a woman whose presence indicated that this crisis had reached the highest levels of government attention. Mr. Petrovic, Attorney General Hawthorne began, her voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to handling national security crises. I understand you have intelligence information that might be valuable to ongoing federal investigations. I also understand that your family has grievances related to Operation Clearwater, I'm prepared to discuss both topics, but first we need to establish some basic ground rules. Alexander sat at the computer terminal with Milena beside him, his rifle within easy reach but not actively threatening anyone. The juxtaposition of domestic normalcy, a young man having a video conference with the armed standoff, created a surreal atmosphere that everyone in the room felt acutely. "Attorney General Hawthorne," he replied, "my ground rules are simple. I want formal acknowledgement that my father died serving American interests, not in a training accident. I want protection for my sister and my team from the organized crime syndicates that have been hunting us. And I want those responsible for abandoning my family to face consequences for their decisions." Deputy Director Kelloway, still sitting among the hostages, looked like he wanted to object to these demands. But Morrison's sharp look silenced him before he could speak. "Mr. Petrovic," Hawthorne continued, "I can acknowledge that your father provided valuable intelligence services to NATO forces. I can also acknowledge that the termination of Operation Clearwater left your family in a difficult situation. However, intelligence operations sometimes end abruptly due to changing circumstances beyond anyone's control." "Changing circumstances," Alexander repeated with bitter precision. "Is that how you describe the decision to let my father be executed, because extracting him would have created diplomatic complications?" The directness of the accusation clearly caught Hawthorne off guard. On live television, being broadcast to news networks around the world, a young man was accusing the U.S. government of deliberately abandoning an intelligence asset to avoid political inconvenience. Lydia recognized the moment when everything could either collapse into mutual recriminations or transform into something approaching justice. "Attorney General Hawthorne," she interjected, "what Alexander is describing isn't unique to his family's case. The termination of intelligence relationships often leaves foreign nationals vulnerable to retaliation from multiple sources. The question is whether we're prepared to acknowledge that reality and take responsibility for the consequences." Hawthorne studied Lydia's face on the video connection. "Agent Reeves, you're currently facing serious charges related to this incident. I'm not sure you're in a position to offer commentary on intelligence policies." "I'm in exactly the position to offer commentary," Lydia replied firmly, "because I'm the person who made promises to the Petrovic family that were later broken by institutional decisions. I'm the one who has to live with the consequences of those broken promises. And I'm the one who understands that this crisis could have been prevented if we had honored our commitments 3 years ago." Around the courthouse lobby, Alexander's companions watched this exchange with obvious tension. They had risked everything on the hope that public pressure might force federal authorities to negotiate honestly. But government officials were clearly still trying to manage the political implications rather than address the underlying injustices. Milena, who had been sitting quietly beside her brother throughout the video conference, suddenly leaned toward the camera. "Miss Attorney General," she said in careful English, "my brother isn't a bad person. He just wants the people who killed our father to say they're sorry." The simplicity of the child's statement created a moment of absolute silence in both the courthouse lobby and the federal conference room. Hawthorne visibly struggled to maintain her professional composure when faced with an 11-year-old girl who had reduced this complex international crisis to its most basic human elements. "Milena," Hawthorne said gently, "I'm very sorry about what happened to your father. And I'm sorry that you and your brother have been in danger because of decisions that adults made." It was the first direct acknowledgement of government responsibility that anyone had offered in 3 years. Alexander's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint that he might believe this negotiation could produce something other than empty promises and institutional denials. "Attorney General Hawthorne," he said carefully, "I have detailed information about Serbian organized crime operations in 6 European countries. I know about money laundering networks, arms trafficking routes, and planned operations against other intelligence assets. I'm prepared to provide all of that information in exchange for formal protection and asylum for my family. Vera looked up from her radio scanner with obvious alarm. Alex, federal teams are still in assault positions. This could all be a delaying tactic while they prepare to storm the building. But Hawthorne was already responding to Alexander's offer with the kind of immediate interest that indicated genuine federal priorities. Mr. Petrovic, the intelligence you're describing could be extremely valuable to ongoing operations. However, asylum and protection agreements require extensive review and approval processes that can't be completed during a hostage crisis. Then we have a problem, Alexander replied. Because I'm not releasing the remaining hostages or surrendering my weapons based on promises of future considerations. My family has already learned what happens when we trust American promises without guarantees. The negotiation had reached the critical moment that Lydia had been anticipating, the point where institutional procedures would either bend to accommodate human justice, or rigid bureaucracy would make resolution impossible. Attorney General Hawthorne, Lydia said, there is precedent for emergency asylum grants in cases involving intelligence assets. The Immigration and Nationality Act allows for expedited processing when national security interests are involved. Morrison, who had been listening to this exchange with growing frustration, finally interrupted. Agent Reeves, you're not qualified to interpret immigration law, and you certainly don't speak for the Attorney General's office. But Hawthorne held up a hand to silence Morrison. Actually, Agent Reeves is correct about the legal precedent. The question is whether this situation meets the criteria for emergency consideration. She looked directly at Alexander through the video connection. Mr. Petrovic, I'm prepared to authorize emergency asylum processing for your family and provisional protection for your associates. In exchange, you will provide immediate preliminary intelligence about organized crime operations, surrender peacefully, and cooperate fully with federal debriefing procedures. The offer was more than anyone in the courthouse had expected. But Alexander still hesitated. 3 years of broken promises had taught him to examine every agreement for hidden conditions and escape clauses. What guarantees do I have that these agreements will be honored after the crisis ends? He asked. You have my word as Attorney General of the United States, Hawthorne replied. Given on live television, witnessed by international media, recorded for posterity. If I break these commitments, my career and my reputation will be destroyed. Milena tugged on her brother's sleeve and whispered something in Serbian. He nodded and whispered back, then turned to address the video camera one final time. Attorney General Hawthorne, my sister wants to know if we can finally stop running and hiding. I'm going to tell her yes, because I choose to believe that some promises are worth keeping. He stood up slowly, his hands clearly visible, and gestured for his companions to lower their weapons. The remaining hostages are being released unconditionally. My team and I are surrendering to federal custody. I'm trusting that the American government will finally keep its word to the Petrovic family. 20 minutes later, federal agents entered the courthouse to find Alexander and his companion sitting calmly with their hands raised, their weapons secured on a nearby table. The hostages were unharmed, but emotionally shattered by their ordeal. Milena sat beside her brother, still clutching her stuffed animal. As federal marshals approached with the careful movements of people who understood they were being watched by the entire world. As Alexander was handcuffed and read his rights, he looked directly at Lydia. 3 years ago, you promised my family safety and a new life. Today, you kept that promise in the only way that was still possible. Thank you. 6 months later, Lydia sat in a small office in the FBI's International Operations Division, her new assignment following a comprehensive review that had resulted in official censure for her unauthorized actions and unofficial recognition for preventing a bloodbath that could have killed dozens of innocent people. On her desk sat 2 items that reminded her daily of the price of broken promises and the possibility of redemption. A photograph of Alexander and Milena at their asylum hearing, both smiling as they signed papers guaranteeing their permanent legal status in the United States. And a handwritten note from Milena that simply said, "Thank you for keeping your promise the second time." The intelligence Alexander had provided had led to the arrest of 37 organized crime figures across 6 countries and the disruption of trafficking networks that had operated with impunity for decades. His debriefing sessions had revealed systematic corruption within multiple intelligence services and prompted congressional hearings about the treatment of foreign assets and their families. But more importantly, for the first time in 3 years, 2 children who had lost everything could finally sleep safely at night, protected by promises that were actually worth keeping. And in an office building in Washington, D.C., a woman who had once chosen institutional loyalty over human justice now spent her days making sure that other families wouldn't face the same abandonment that had nearly destroyed the Petrovic children. Sometimes the most important victories weren't about following procedures or maintaining bureaucratic order. Sometimes they were about having the courage to keep promises that should have been kept long ago. Regardless of the personal cost or professional consequences, the story had ended with justice. But it had begun with a simple recognition that some obligations transcend official duties, that the promises made to desperate people in impossible circumstances create bonds that neither time nor institutional policies can break. As Lydia often told new agents during their training, heroism isn't about having the right credentials or following the proper protocols. It's about recognizing when human decency demands that you ignore those protocols and do what's right, even if it costs you everything you thought you valued. Some promises once made become part of who you are. Breaking them breaks something essential in yourself. Keeping them, regardless of the cost, restores not only trust between people, but faith in the possibility that justice can still matter in a world that often seems to have forgotten what justice means. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.